imagine tens of thousands of people, right? They're all gathered in this massive open field in Nigeria.
Yeah, just an absolute sea of people.
Exactly. And the air is just incredibly heavy with emotion. People are weeping. Um, they are literally throwing away physical crutches. I mean, the spiritual ecstasy is practically deafening.
Right, it's at a total fever pitch.
And then instantly the music stops, the emotional climax just cuts off, and the entire event abruptly pivots into this hyper-organized, like, military-grade data collection center.
It is a stunning shift in tone, honestly. You go from these massive declarations of divine miracles straight to someone basically dictating how to write down 11-digit phone numbers in capital letters.
Welcome to today's deep dive. For you, the listener, we are unpacking what is essentially a masterclass in mass communication. Like, how and why does a global leader pivot a huge, diverse crowd from a state of deep spiritual guilt up to physical euphoria and finally into this state of highly organized logistical action, all in just a matter of minutes?
Well, it requires a really profound understanding of human psychology and sociology and architectural pacing, really. You are essentially building a reality for an audience to inhabit.
And we are analyzing a reality that was built just yesterday. Today is July 4th, 2026. The sources on the table for this deep dive are a sermon outline PDF and a raw YouTube transcript from an enormous event that happened on Friday, July 3rd, 2026.
Right, it's the Global Crusade with Kumuyi, which was held at the Deeper Life New Conference Center in Otukpo, Benue State, Nigeria.
Yes, and Pastor W.F. Kumuyi is delivering a message titled Glorious Freedom by Grace Through Faith in Christ. Now, I want to be super clear right up front for you listening, regardless of your personal worldview, and we aren't here to take any sides or endorse the specific religious or political viewpoints, but analyzing his methodology here impartially reveals just so much about how to move people.
Oh, absolutely. It's an incredible structural study.
Okay, let's unpack this. To really grasp the impact of this message, we have to look at how Kumuyi organizes these, massive, abstract theological concepts. Because he doesn't just throw doctrines at the crowd, right?
No, not at all. He gives them a spatial metaphor.
Yeah, he tells them they are looking at a 3-story house. The freedom they want is on the top floor, but they can't just teleport there.
Right, there's no elevator. They have to walk up the stairs.
Yeah.
Basically conquering one psychological state at a time.
Exactly.
And what's fascinating here is how he defines the barrier to entry on that very first level, the ground floor. He focuses on the concept of the penitent.
It's kind of an old school word.
It is, yeah. But Kumuyi strips away the religious jargon to get at this core psychological state, which is radical, absolute responsibility. He basically defines a penitent as someone who just drops every single defense mechanism.
Right, so you stop blaming your upbringing or your circumstances or society. You simply state, I am the guilty one.
Exactly. It is a brutal stripping away of the ego.
I mean, it's incredibly difficult for the human mind to do that, to just accept total blame without some sort of contrast to show what happens if you don't.
And he actually provides that exact contrast by comparing the penitent human to Satan.
Oh, wow. That's a huge jump.
It is. In the theological framework Kumuyi presents, Satan has no capacity for forgiveness. And the reasoning he gives is really striking. He says Satan sinned in the light without being tempted, like he had full knowledge, full power, and chose rebellion entirely on his own.
So the implication there is that human failing is often a product of, being dragged down or deceived, whereas ultimate evil is a solitary, fully informed choice.
Right, and because Satan's fate is sealed, his only remaining function is to drag others into his camp, using things like hypocrisy and betrayal.
So by framing it that way, Kumuyi really raises the stakes for the individual standing out in that crowd.
Oh, massively. Confessing your guilt isn't just about feeling a little lighter. It is positioned as a literal cosmic defection. You're abandoning the rebellion.
But cosmic rebellion is still a very abstract idea. It's hard to visualize. So what makes this rhetorical structure work so well is how Kumuyi instantly grounds it.
Yeah, he tells a story.
He does. He tells a story about a restaurant worker who constantly steals pieces of chicken from the workplace freezer.
Yeah.
I mean, we go from the fall of Lucifer to a guy stuffing frozen poultry under his shirt.
Which is such a deliberate juxtaposition.
Yeah.
It takes this really heavy theological concept of secret sin and places it in this mundane, totally relatable setting.
Right.
And the worker in the story, he believes he is highly strategic, Before he steals the meat, he checks his horizontal surroundings. He looks left, he looks right. He makes sure his peers aren't watching.
But he never looks up.
Exactly.
And because he is entirely focused on the horizontal plane, just looking left and right, he completely misses a coworker who is hiding up in the ceiling watching the entire crime.
The horizontal versus the vertical perspective. It's a brilliant encapsulation of how humans handle guilt, really. We are so focused on managing our reputation among our peers that we just completely ignore the higher authority.
So this coworker climbs down the next day and leverages the secret. He basically blackmails the thief, demanding that the thief work all of his overtime shifts.
Yeah, and if the thief refuses, the coworker will report the stolen meat to the manager, so the thief is completely trapped.
When I was reading through this transcript, the mechanism here immediately made me think of modern ransomware attacks.
Oh, that is a highly relevant parallel.
Yep.
Break down how that mechanism functions in this context.
Okay, so think about a digital hacker who penetrates a company's servers and encrypts their most sensitive data.
Right.
The hacker demands a ransom, and the company, terrified of the public exposure or the loss of their assets, they pay it. But paying the ransom doesn't free them.
No, it just confirms to the hacker that they are a viable target.
Exactly. They become slaves to the hacker's demands. So the coworker in the ceiling is the hacker. The stolen meat is the compromised data.
That's a great way to look at it.
Yeah, and Kumuyi's theological point is that the devil operates like a ransomware syndicate, basically keeping sinners in a state of perpetual, exhausting bondage through the threat of exposing their past.
Because the cost of the ransom is your continued subservience to guilt. You are essentially working spiritual overtime for an entity that hates you.
Right.
And the only way to break a ransomware attack, the only way to strip the hacker of their power entirely, is to refuse to pay, accept the consequences, and bring the breach into the light.
Which is exactly what the exhausted worker finally does in the story. He bypasses the blackmailer, he goes directly to the manager, falls to his knees, and voluntarily confesses. He just says, I am the one stealing the meat.
And by bringing the secret into the light voluntarily, he embodies that penitent state we discussed earlier.
The absolute responsibility?
Exactly. And the manager forgives him entirely. The theological weight Kumuyi anchors here, referencing Colossians chapter 1 and Acts chapter 5, is massive.
Yeah.
Because the moment that forgiveness is granted by the ultimate authority, the blackmailer's leverage just evaporates.
Right, because when the coworker demands overtime the next day, the worker can just say, go ahead and report me. The manager already knows the debt is canceled.
The psychological relief of that moment for someone holding on to deep guilt must be absolutely staggering.
It really must be.
Kumuyi describes it as being translated from the power of darkness into the kingdom of light. You are moved under a shelter where the blackmailer just has no jurisdiction anymore.
So that resolves the spiritual guilt. The foundation of the house is secure, and the crowd has moved up to the first floor. But here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Because you can't just leave a massive crowd sitting in quiet internal reflection, right? Invisible forgiveness creates a psychological vacuum. Like, you feel lighter, but there is no outward proof that anything actually happened.
Right, it's all internal.
So how does a speaker prove to tens of thousands of people that this invisible transaction is real?
You have to manifest it physically. The internal psychological state must be mirrored by an external, undeniable reality. And this brings us to the next level of Kumuyi's architectural structure.
Right, transitioning from spiritual pardon to physical restoration. And the shift in the transcript here is just dramatic.
It really is.
Kumuyi pivots from these theological concepts to literal physical manifestations of power in the human body.
He does, and he paves the way for this by grounding it in the biblical narrative of Acts chapter 8, where Philip goes to Samaria. Kumuyi provides some vital sociological and geographical context here that's really important.
Right, setting the scene.
Yes. He emphasizes that Jerusalem was historically and culturally higher, while Samaria was lower.
It's a valley in every sense of the word.
Yes, exactly. A valley of defilement, despair, and disease.
Uh-huh.
Samaria was a place populated by people who were considered outcasts, people who had previously rejected the prevailing religious structure. But God sends Philip down into that valley anyway.
So the rhetoric here establishes that grace does not just stay on the pristine mountaintop. It actively flows downward into the lowest, most broken social castes.
Precisely. And when Philip preached in that valley, profound miracles occurred.
And then Kumuyi uses that ancient history as a direct bridge to the present moment in that field in Otukbo.
Yes, he asserts that the power that operated in Samaria is identical to the power present in the crowd right now.
He just abandons metaphors completely at this point and starts listing severe, specific afflictions.
The transcript shows him declaring victory over paralysis, weak bones, blindness, deafness, swellings, cancer, sickle cell disease. I mean, he tells the crowd that at the mention of the name of Jesus, these physical realities are vanishing.
I want to push on this a bit, though, because if you are an outside observer or, someone studying mass psychology, you look at a crowd of that size primed by the intense emotional release of confessing their guilt, and you see an incredibly potent cocktail.
Oh, absolutely.
You have the ultimate placebo effect mixed with deep, deep spiritual catharsis. When your brain genuinely believes the heavy, invisible chains of guilt are gone, the physiological response is enormous.
Yes.
The sheer volume of collective expectation could make someone feel like their physical ailments are disappearing. So I ask you, the listener, imagine standing in that environment. How does that intense atmosphere shape your physical reality?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, though, reducing it purely to a psychological placebo effect really misses the mechanism of why the crowd is reacting with such explosive joy.
Fair point.
Kumuyi isn't using the language of psychology. He is invoking literal cosmic authority. For the people in that field, this isn't a psychosomatic release.
Yeah.
To them, it is the creator of the universe actively rewriting their biology in real time.
Right. It's the visible validation of the invisible part. It actually reminds me of the biblical story where Jesus asks, which is easier to say, your sins are forgiven, or get up and walk. The physical healing is required to prove that the spiritual authority is real.
Exactly. The physical restoration is the receipt for the spiritual transaction.
Oh, I like that. The receipt.
Yeah, because when someone drops their crutches in front of thousands of people, it is an undeniable community-wide signal that the spiritual baggage has been dropped as well. It bonds the crowd together in a shared, visible reality.
Right. They aren't just isolated individuals who feel less guilty. They are a collective witnessing a tangible transformation.
And that means they are now firmly standing on the second floor.
Okay, so the crowd is spiritually cleansed. They are physically primed. The emotional energy is at an absolute peak. They are ready for the top floor.
The third level.
Right. This is where the theological loop has to close. But a concept like glorious freedom can feel too abstract, too unearned, especially for a crowd that was just heavily focused on their own deep guilt.
Which is exactly why Kumuyi introduces a crucial theological mechanism to settle that tension, which is propitiation. He pulls from Romans chapter 3 to explain that while humans are justified freely by grace, it isn't simply ignored. When you come to the Lord, He knows your past, and He has every right to condemn you.
So how does the human brain accept a free pardon without feeling like a fraud? Because the scales of justice still feel unbalanced. Let's say someone vandalizes your house, right? They shatter your front window. They can apologize and you can forgive them, but the window is still broken.
The damage is done.
Exactly. Until someone actually pulls out their wallet and pays the $500 for the glass, the relationship isn't truly fixed. The debt just kind of hangs in the air.
And that is the exact cognitive dissonance propitiation solves. The cosmic window is broken. But Kumuyi explains that Christ pays a debt He didn't owe, precisely because humanity couldn't pay the debt it did owe.
Right.
God didn't delegate this to an angel. He sent the Son to absorb the cost. So the scales are balanced, the window's paid for, and the believer can step into freedom without the lingering psychological shadow of an unpaid debt.
So what does this all mean? How does a massive global operation actually land the plane after reaching this level of emotional and theological climax?
Well, in many settings, this is where the music swells, the crowd prays a final prayer of surrender, and they all just drift home into the night.
Yeah, but if you just let them drift home, that intense spiritual high will inevitably dissipate. By Tuesday, the reality of their daily lives will crush the euphoria.
Exactly.
And this is where the structure completely caught me off guard. The spiritual ecstasy doesn't just slowly fade out. It instantly pivots into a massive, hyper-organized administrative operation.
It's true. Kumuyi steps back, an officiating minister takes the microphone, and suddenly it sounds like a military deployment.
The contrast is jarring, but it is highly intentional. The minister begins deploying counselors to very specific zones. He's calling out the tents on the right, the massive extension in the back, the car park, the supermarket.
And the instructions to these counselors are wildly specific. They are not told to go hold hands and pray. They are explicitly instructed to capture data. The minister is literally barking out formatting rules over the loudspeakers.
Yes. Write clearly with capital letters. Write legibly. They are mandated to collect exact names, physical addresses, and 11-digit phone numbers.
And the hyperlocal nature of it is fascinating. The minister starts listing off local landmarks to ensure the addresses are accurate.
Yeah, Odugo Street, the Federal Road, Owini Street.
Exactly.
And it extends beyond the physical field, too. For the massive global audience watching online, they are repeatedly directed to a specific URL-gckhq.org, connect to, input their data digitally.
Right.
Like right in the middle of a spiritual awakening, they're building an actionable, real-time database.
Which is brilliant, really. That this raises an important question. Why interrupt a sacred moment with data entry?
Right.
Because emotion is fleeting, but systems endure. You sustain a spiritual high by immediately anchoring it into a tangible structure. You give the abstract feeling a literal physical address.
And the integration into a community system prevents the hacker from the ceiling from regaining leverage.
No, that's a great point.
Because if they go home alone, the isolation makes them vulnerable. If they're plugged into a database, someone is calling them tomorrow.
And they don't even wait for a phone call, actually. The organizers announce a lunch hour with Jesus for all the new converts, scheduled for 3:00 p.m. the very next day.
And I really want to ground that timeline for you, the listener, because this crusade transcript is from yesterday, July 3rd. That means this massive logistical follow-up, this lunch hour, is happening today, July 4th, at 3:00 p.m.
Wow.
The turnaround time is less than 24 hours. They strike while the iron is blazing hot.
It is a masterful retention strategy. You offer a spiritual and physical gathering point immediately. The architecture of the message isn't complete until the door is locked behind them, essentially, so they can't fall back down the stairs.
That makes total sense.
I want to pull a specific quote from Pastor Kumuyi's sermon that perfectly encapsulates this entire dynamic. During his explanation of hypocrisy earlier on, he said, "No matter how a person pretends, their actions will reveal their intention."
Right. And he was aiming that at people who intend to do evil but mask it with good behavior.
He was. But apply that same logic to the organizers of this crusade. Their deep, genuine intention to save souls and alter lives is definitively proven by their meticulous logistics.
Yeah, the capital letters, the specific street names, the 11-digit phone numbers.
Exactly. Those actions reveal an intention that goes far beyond just putting on an emotional show. They intend to permanently track, support, and integrate these people.
It's the ultimate proof of concept. I mean, you don't build the database of 11-digit phone numbers unless you fully intend to call every single one of them.
Exactly. The logistics validate the theology, just as the physical healing validated the spiritual pardon.
Wow. This has been a really profound journey through the architecture of mass communication today. We explored the deep psychological release of the ground floor dropping the ego, confessing secret sins, and voiding the ransom of the metaphorical meat thief.
We did.
And then we moved up to examine the intense environment required to make invisible grace visible through mass physical healing. And finally, we saw the awe-inspiring organizational machinery on the top floor, capturing and structuring that transformed crowd before the emotion could fade.
It really demonstrates that vision without execution is just an illusion. The rigid structure is what makes the spiritual vision a sustainable reality.
Yeah, so whether you are preparing to pitch an idea in a boardroom, or you're studying mass media, or you're simply fascinated by how human beings change, understanding how to build those stairs, how to move people from internal reflection to immediate trackable action is an invaluable tool.
It really changes how you view any large-scale message.
It really does. But before we leave you today, I want to offer a final thought to mull over, building on that analogy of the meat thief. The thief was trapped because he only looked horizontally at his peers, right? He never looked vertically at the ceiling. And in our hyper-connected modern world, we spend almost all our time looking left and right. We look horizontally at our social feeds, constantly managing our image, worrying entirely about what our peers think of our actions.
We really are conditioned to fear the horizontal gaze above all else.
We are. So I ask you, the listener, what is your equivalent of looking up? In a digital era where every single move is tracked by algorithms, data brokers, and horizontal surveillance, who or what is the ultimate witness to your secret life? When the horizontal world finally looks away, what are you doing when you think no one is watching? Something to think about. Until next time, keep digging deeper.